Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. Welcome. So the 4th of February, 2026. It's time for Wednesday office hours. In the prep video, I read through part of the first article, the overaccumulation of productive capital or of finance capital, a view from the outskirts of a Marxist debate by Runa Skarstein. And I hope that intrigued you about some of the underlying issues, some of which I need to get back to. And it's certainly clear that everyone is talking about it. And, Michael Hudson notwithstanding, it's important to get a handle on this component of profits without getting into the sort of non-anti-imperialist Marxism or new Marxism thing, so-called Western Marxism, doesn't. I would assert to you that this does not. Talking about the financial sector is, as Marx identified, uh, not simply the question of capital, but also the people in it, and there is agency in this as well. So he doesn't want to, and Marx doesn't include their labor in that kind of activity, although I think, as you can see, that there is a outsized proportion of capital per person manipulating it, and there is a whole body of, you could say, unpaid labor, but it's not really unpaid. Um, you know, this is the problem of being sort of over determining, as it were, labor power. And well, this is the standard debates, I think, are really important. Um, it is not against the idea that commodification occurs in the finance sector, and that commodity relations are not unimportant, uh, uh, the, considering how the financial crisis essentially was the product of a kind of commodified subprime mortgage instruments. So that's the other part of the um, kind of analysis. And so it is, in fact, an overproduction of capital. And now the question is whether it is also the overproduction of means of production. And um, I would assert that it is, that it's possible to deal with it in that way. and hence get some analytic benefit from doing that stuff. So I think it's important to look at those things. And there's a subcategory of Marxist analysis that deals with financial Marxism. And in some cases, it's people who have worked in the City of London and who have, ideological skills as well, and who have sort of combined those sort of exercises together. And there are people who do have finance skills, like Michael Hudson, in fact, since I've mentioned him. And that kind of is important. It's important to have that perspective, even though, yes, as academics, there's this tendency to go off into, histories of money, histories of banking, histories of capital, but capital has a history, and I think we shouldn't ignore that. So that's kind of the one side of that we might consider. So rather than finishing off the reading of Rune Skarstein's article, or maybe I'll get to read the conclusion. Because much of this analysis is about certain types of instruments. For example, private equity funds, the rise of, hedge funds, et cetera, et cetera. And it can be problematic. I mean, it's problematic from just being a conventional commercial capitalist, and adding on or subjecting it to a Marxist analysis makes it even more problematic for some folks, mainly because you have to have, a lot of skills and an awareness of all of the underlying issues. Similarly, and I don't want to I'll probably argue this somewhere else at a future date, is, the contours of the Capitalocene debate, which in and of itself, just without getting into sort of a lexical deal, it signifies, I think, a concern for making the Anthropocene argument more precise. And I like thinking that it does that, although it needs more explication. So anyway, without getting too far afield, it is self-evident that 30% or even 5% real return on financial assets in economies which uh, grow at 2.5% or less per year is impossible in the long run. For such returns to be realized, even in the shorter term, there has to be a redistribution of incomes from wages to profits, combined with a redistribution of profits from the productive sectors of the economy to the financial sector. We have seen that the former type, profits from the productive sectors, took place in the US to a considerable extent. As Table 5 shows, there was also a formidable redistribution of profits from the productive sectors to the financial sector. The financial sector's share of total corporate profits was doubled from an average of 18.3% in 1980 to 1990 to 36.2% in 2001 to 2006, reaching a peak of 40.8% in 2001 to 2. Moreover, the financial sector's share of total GDP rose from 44.8% in 1980-82 to 8.1% in 2007. In the same period, manufacturing industry's share of total GDP declined by almost 8 percentage points from 19.4 to 11.7. The expansion of the financial sector took place along with a virtual deindustrialization in the US. And this is the current state that, there's all these claims about we're going to bring back manufacturing to the United States. Well, some people, short of actually having an industrial policy, this is just PR. It is political, vapor in that particular sense, because you need to have infrastructure, resources. I haven't yet seen how, for example, lithium mines in Nevada are going to be, going to offset, even though the claim is that they will, but, are they going to do this soon or in a decade? Because that's kind of the time frame that the promises are occurring, aside from the fact that it causes, regional conflict and depredation and all that other sort of stuff. And so just to talk about that kind of idea, the issue is that other countries, the international value chain, supply chains have changed the nature of the way in which we think about this stuff. So, anyway, next paragraph. The decline of the financial sector's share of total corporate profits from 40.8% in 2001 to 2 to 33% in 2007 signifies that this redistribution process had reached an upper limit. We have seen that the volume of finance capital is not recorded in national accounts. Another issue. However, there are clear indications of its growth in size. One indication is that the amount outstanding of over-the-counter derivatives rose from 127,560 billion US dollars to a historical peak of 683,800 billion, 47 times the US GDP in June 2008, corresponding to an increase of 32% per year, period. Another indication is that the global financial wealth of high net worth individuals, note that that's kind of, the current irritation with the 1%, HNWT, increased from 30,700 billion US dollars in 2004 to a historical peak of $40.7 trillion in 2007. And so if we consider table 5, without getting too crazy about it, you can see where some of these numbers are coming from. You can see a steady increase in the columns. For, financial sector share of total profits, etc. And needless to say, it's significant. Now, of course, there's no reason to believe that all CDT derivatives are profit yielding or interest bearing. On the other hand, financial wealth is possessed not only by, by rich folks, high net worth individuals. Large financial assets are held by less wealthy persons than most of us, as well as by institutions such as banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and hedge funds. Against this background, a third indication seems to be reasonably accurate. One study reports that the total amount of profit-seeking financial assets increased 3 times more than the worldwide GDP, from 12 trillion to 196 trillion, which was 4 times larger. Well, than the total world GDP in that year to get an impression of the magnitude. An average return of 7% on 196,000 billion US dollars corresponds exactly to the total GDP of the US in 2007. The volume of corporate profits in the US financial sector rose from $325.9 billion in 2003 to $427.6 billion in 2006, and declined to $323.8 in 2007, and collapsed to $128 billion in 2008. So while profits stagnated or fell, finance capital continued growing, leading to a fall of the profit rate in that sector. In other words, the accumulation of finance capital exceeded its profit possibilities, which means that overaccumulation of finance capital. Moreover, the data signifies that when this volume of finance capital is included in the denominator of the profit rate, also the rate of profit in the US corporate sector as a whole declined at least since 2004. Thus, the increasing mass of finance capital became an unbearable burden to the economy as a whole, which seems, undeniable in that sense. Therefore, the economic crisis Therefore, the economic crisis had to come with falling asset prices, a credit crunch, falling real investments, falling effective demand, and rising unemployment, kind of where we are now. But could the present crisis have been averted by a quote unquote better regulation of the financial sector? Now, there's reason for some doubt. First, history teaches us that economic regulation and capitalism are regulations in capitalism are virtually always behind. They trail the innovations of finance capital, new instruments, et cetera, and then, the regulators figure out what's going on and try and constrain it. Guardrails in the current jargon. Second, the analysis in the foregoing sections indicates that the accumulation model of the liberalized US economy had to lead to the crisis. In particular, the low-wage policy leading to a rapidly increasing income inequality both necessitated and created new mechanisms for maintaining effective demand, as well as the accumulation of finance capital. But what is at stake is not only regulations, but the entire accumulation model of financialized capitalism. This model contains strongly self-destructive features. That tendency to fall thing is sort of in the background. The mainstream argument in favor of free financial markets is that devices such as credit derivatives, hedge funds, private equity funds serve to correct asset prices and create market equilibrium. Now, by contrast, with these devices, capitalism has not only become gravely unstable, but has developed strongly cannibalistic features. Pretty visceral in that sense. But is also, without talking too much about barbarism, you can see how you can plug into this anthropological kind of analogy, metaphor, the whole business of commodity fetishism, etc. Now, the most visible achievement of the new financial innovation so far is enriching financial speculators, squeezing the productive sectors of the economy through a drastic redistribution of total profits from the real economy to the financial sector, and through redistribution of incomes from wages to profit. There's just a surge of profit-taking this week. The financial sector has grown to a gigantic parasitic machinery, which through the luxury consumption of its actors You can't have that many super vehicles, right? And recurring crises squander enormous economic and human resources in its hunting for a biggest possible share of total profits. The rescue actions of the governments have prevented, this is 2008, right? Have prevented a total economic collapse. However, they also prevented large amounts of financial assets from being sufficiently depreciated. So we have, the overinflated stuff. The present dilemma is that the situation of overaccumulation of finance capital still prevails, does to this day, while political and economic forces prevent continued deficit government spending, which could increase effective demand and stimulate employment. Now, you put that against, public policy or actions of a annoying sort, Doge, for example. The Project 2025 wish list to shrink the U.S. economy, or at least shrink the federal government, which, because they're idiots, do not realize that effective demand and stimulated employment, well, they don't give a shit about that. I mean, that's just kind of where they are. And so that's kind of the issue. I hope you'll look back on this article. It has very good bibliography and references that I think you should take advantage of. Now, the second thing which I want to look at is an article, and unfortunately, this is kind of where reading the other article kind of gets you to, and because you begin to remind yourself, yes, there is Hilferding in terms of Marxist finance capital, and I haven't given it the full attention, much as like I never gave it the full attention when I had the physical copy of the book in front of me. Finance Capital and Financialization, a comparative reading of Marx and Hilferding. By Monchiot. Monagot, sorry. Matari Pierre Monagot. So, this paper compares the definitions of the concept of financial capital in the work of Karl Marx and Rudolf Hilferding. And so I'll read through a little bit of this and then stop because it's going to take a long time to get through all 25 pages. I'll probably skip to the end just to conclude our little session here. This paper compares the definitions of the concept of finance capital in the work of Karl Marx and Rudolf Hilferding. While Marx outlines a definition of finance capital as the separation and monopolization of capital money transactions, Hilferding refers to the merger of banking and industry and the domination of the latter, that is, industry, by the former. Now, in spite of their differences, both definitions are based on an analysis of the relationship between the credit system and production. Through an examination of the similarities and differences between the two authors, the paper argues that while Marx's ambition was to propose a general theory of finance capital, Hilferding constructed a theory of the financialization of capitalism. Needless to say, it was an ambition, and, these are those counterfactuals we would love to indulge. We just have to fill in some of the problems. So, the contribution of the Critique of Political Economy, the 1859 version, and the addenda to Theories of Surplus Value, Section 1 of Volume 1 of Capital, the 1867 version, and especially Section 5, we've seen this referred to before, of Volume 3 of Capital, contain the essentials of Marx's analyses of money and the credit system in relation to, or separately from, the fundamental problems of his value theory. Needless to say, lot of ink's been spilled on this. Duncan Foley, Susanna Brunoff, Mosley, all the lights have looked at this problem. Various elements of Marx's monetary thought and financial thought have been the subject of specific studies, including his critique of both the currency principle and the banking schools. You can see where that, the routing of that, Rubin, Brunhoff, Mandel, etc. His theory of the non-existence of a natural interest rate, his definition of the concept of fictitious capital, and the relationship between these elements, or among these elements, and the capitalist cycle. However, there is little, if any, reconstruction of all of Marx's monetary and financial thought. There really is, and that's, we're more the worst for it. The difficulties for Marxism in analyzing the root causes of finance capital domination cannot be explained solely as the result of Marx's incomplete investigation or the redoubtable difficulties faced by all the different editors of Section 5 of, Volume 3 since Engels, right? After Engels managed to cobble all these things together. Until 3 decades ago, Marxist scholars tended to consider financial questions exclusively as a matter of, which is pretty bog standard orthodoxy, a matter of struggle between factions of the dominant class. Insofar as this is a struggle for the distribution of surplus value already created, financial problems did not attract much of their attention. This is the productivist, sort of bias. You need to think of it, let me break here for a second. And I think you need to think of certain circulatory elements, Department 2, or circuits, as having their own kind of subcategory of production. Even though you're pushing paper, something is being produced. And yet, yes, we can talk about the equivalence question, which I think is the underlying, it's an identification problem common in fact to social science. But you can see how much that can be an issue. Anyway, back to the text. Their inclination to grant little importance to the study of financial problems has been reinforced by the fact that until recently, the evolution of surplus value distribution among the great fractions of the dominant classes did not induce fundamental changes in the conditions of the working class. In fact, you can see that today. The conditions have not changed with increased, value. Both types of reasons, that is theoretical and historical, explain why Marxist scholars have paid little attention to Marxist writings on money and finance. Since the end of the Bretton Woods system and the 1973-74 world crisis, the attempts in this direction tended to identify money with debt, because Bretton Woods and the creation of, reserve currencies and, the domination of, things like the IMF, etc., World Bank, blah, blah, blah. In other words, they were attempts to bring Marx's monetary thought closer to that of Keynes and the post-Keynesians. So we've looked before at Bellafiore, Ito, and Lapavitsas, and only a few have tried to reconstruct Marx's monetary thought from the Section 1 of Capital. Now, remarking, of course, here, let me break for a second, that volume 1 is kind of front loaded, right? The demands of trying to get it published, obviously created a kind of editing or compression crisis that we could spend a great deal of time, yammering about what we shouldn't. But I think that's really the important thing, is that despite the fact that you can have a new translation, a good new translation of Capital Volume 1, we cannot let it sit alone. I mean, it does not sit in isolation. It still sits with probably the larger project that somebody will, after I'm dead, certainly, will be, performing on volumes 2 and 3, and of course, the theories of surplus value, which is 4, but maybe not 4. It's actually sort of 2.5, maybe. Anyway, leaving aside considerations of his seminal contribution to the debate on imperialism, and yes, you can see all the lights there, Bukharin, Lenin, Howard and King, actually kind of interesting, and economic policy transformations between the eras of mercantilism and monopoly capital. Hilferding's contribution to financial thought has been the subject of considerable discussion. Hilferding proposed a general definition of finance capital as a fusion of banking and industry under the dominance of the banks. This is an institutionalist analysis, needless to say. While this definition was taken up by most Marxist theoreticians, his thesis of the domination of banking over industry has been the object of harsh polemics. Yes, you can see that because this is that productivist bias again, or, Department 1, Department 2, and not being able to see that, it's not a simple set, because Marx talks about circuits and etc. This is a sedimented set of relations, if you want to put it that way. But it's worth looking at the debates simply because you can sort of you can do a spreadsheet of, okay, this one has a productivist bias, this one, looks at it as a structural problem or an institutionalist problem, and et cetera, et cetera. Hilferding has been reproached for confusing a specific historical situation with a structural feature of capitalism. Originally formulated by Bernstein, this criticism was developed by, Sweezy, right? Brandon Sweezy, and shared the Pauls, and shared by a majority of readers of Finance Capital after the war and during the mixed economy era. That alone, the mixed economy era, is actually one worth a lot of historical analysis, or maybe it's already been plumbed. Anyway, Sweezy himself would retract his judgment on Hilferding insofar as financial globalization forced him to revise some of the premises of his theory. Broadly speaking, financial globalization and contemporary crises gave rise to a newly important discussion of monetary and financial issues within Marxism. A growing number of works have taken up aspects of the financial theories of Marx and Hilferding in order to update Marxist interpretations of the current phase of capitalism. And Duminil and Levy, Brunoff et al., Brenner, Mandel, of course. And so you have, major lights that need to be, what is to be read. This paper, Monagot, compares Marx's and Hilferding's definitions of finance capital, exploring the similarities and differences in their respective analyses. It supports the thesis that while Marx proposed a general definition of finance capital as the separation and monopolization of capital money transactions, the separation and monopolization of capital money transactions, Hilferding constructed a theory of financialization of capital. More precisely, Hilferding studied the various methods in which the institutions of the financial system penetrated and dominated the economy as a whole. So this paper is structured as follows. Starting from the conceptual difference between usury and credit. We're going to come back to this usury issue because it's certainly mentioned in other writings here on, this. There's a kind of with respect, there's a kind of usury threshold in capitalism that, it becomes this bizarre, with all due respect, a legal problem. But anyway, it considers the formation of a credit system under capitalist conditions of production. Section 1, these developments lead us to deduce a general and formal definition of Marx's concept of finance capital as the separation and monopolization of capital money transactions. It is from this definition that we must understand the formation of financiers, rentier capitalism, right? Financiers as a class faction. See, already, if you gotta look at it from an agency question, as a class faction. If this doesn't, this doesn't dissolve the issue, that remains about class struggle, and that the various aspects of the credit system are articulated. Finally, in a fourth section, we show how Hilferding, whose analysis relied to a large extent on Marx, proposed a general theory of the financialization of capitalist production. So this financialization, not unlike the concept of, subsumption or securitization, there's stuff still to work on in that context. So let's start a little bit. We're going to run out of time. From usury to credit system, finance capital is not formally distinguished from other historical forms of money trade. It has existed in societies with different organization and exchange of their members' activity and appears to be a transhistorical phenomenon. That alone raises all kinds of other issues. Anyway, historical issue. The circulation of money merely indicates the existence of commodity exchange, that is, the exchange of products manufactured by private producers operating independently. For Marx, this commercial division of labor materializes along multiple historical paths and in societies with varying relationships of production. Central to Marx is that the market division of labor brings with it the possibility of the formation of social groups specialized in commodity trading and monetary operations. Now, whether you call them a class is a whole another question. The emergence of a class of merchants brings about the mediations between separate producers who manufacture for a market. These operations correspondingly become the merchant's reason for existence and the means to their enrichment. Introduced between producers, merchants make up a group that buys to sell and vice versa, sells to buy. The motive for their transactions is not the possession of the products, we can argue that, but the money obtained through buying and selling. That may be an oversimplification and problematic in defining other things like wealth, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the formation of a merchant class translates into the development of trade as an autonomous function, disconnected from producers. The same economic conditions also make possible the emergence and autonomy of the money trade as the activity of a special group. The development of the merchant and of the money trader or usurer are correlates of the recognition of money as the general form of wealth. Even that we can, argue the existence of users' capital, notes Marx, requires, quote, that at least a portion of products should be transformed into commodities. A portion of products should be transformed into commodities, and that money should have developed in its various functions along with the trade in commodities. Usury, the primitive form of interest-bearing capitalist, Marx referred generically to finance activities developed in diverse societies. Usury works like a leech on the producers in different modes of production, since they carry out a circulation of money and commodities. For Marx, usurer capital and its twin brother, commercial capital, define an antediluvian form of capital. Now, this is important because, this is, and because it's the 1894 version, of all this stuff, Engels may have been at work here as well. Usurer's capital is the characteristic form of interest-bearing capital, corresponds, this is Marx, to the predominance of small-scale production of self-employed peasant and small master craftsmen, artisan production. When the laborer is confronted by the conditions of labor and by the product of labor in the shape of capital, as under the developed capitalist mode of production, he has no occasion to borrow any money as a producer. So note there's a scalar element here. When he does any money borrowing, he does so, for instance, at the pawn shop to secure personal necessities, but wherever the laborer is the owner, whether actual or nominal, that's really important there, of his conditions of labor and his product, he stands as a producer in relation to the moneylender's capital, which confronts him as usurer's capital. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this one quote, partially because it kind of, tautologizes or is circular in certain ways. But anyway, however, close quote. However, under certain historical conditions, usury acts as an agent dissolving the power of landowners, as well as a powerful agent separating the producer from the conditions of production. It is this phenomenon that makes the usurer an actor in undermining the economic foundations of pre-capitalist societies. Quote Marx, the characteristic forms, however, in which users' capital exists in periods antedating, before capitalist production, are of two kinds. So note the footnote that talks about pre-capitalist, economic, there's a whole thing about pre-capitalist stuff because it's a kind of focus, with all due respect to Western Marxism, that became really important in terms of looking at kind of the humanistic element, the foundational, the micro foundations, as it were, of Marx's political economy. So the characteristic forms, however, in which usurer's capital exists in periods antedating capitalist production are of two kinds. I purposely say characteristic forms. The same forms repeat themselves on the basis of capitalist production, but as mere subordinate forms. Remember what I just said about earlier on in another context about, subcategories. They are then no longer the forms which determine the character of interest-bearing capital. These two forms are, first, usury by lending money to extravagant members of the upper classes, particularly landowners. Secondly, usury by lending money to small producers who produce their own conditions of labor. This includes the artisan, but mainly the peasant, since particularly under pre-capitalist conditions, insofar as they permit of small independent individual producers, the peasant class necessarily constitutes the overwhelming majority of them. Both the ruin of rich landowners through usury and the impoverishment of the small producers lead to the formation and concentration of large amounts of money capital. Right. But to what extent This process does away with the old mode of production. See, this is the lurch backwards to, techno-feudalism, as happened in modern Europe, and whether it puts the capitalist mode of production in its stead depends entirely upon the age of historical development, the attendant circumstances. So a lot there, and an interesting problem for so many people because of the way in which we can interpret these kinds of elements. So anyway, the study of these stages and concomitant historical circumstances corresponds to the analysis of the so-called processes of transition to capitalism. And yes, that just bogs us down in, a body of literature that's really important, that talks about, even though it is sort of the classics of Western Marxism, the issues of transition from feudalism to capitalism, and the side arguments of despotism, blah blah blah. Although Marx points to the importance of this revolutionary aspect of usury in the formation of capitalism, he also points to its end once the conditions of wage labor are established. That's actually a really important point, and probably merits looking at Maurice Dobb for the kind of more recent version of that, particularly in the context of when Dobb is writing, i.e., during World War II. Wage labor modifies the role and place of financial activities in the economy. Wage labor modifies the role and place of financial activities in the economy. Through usury, the activities of interest-bearing capital are converted into a system of credit. That is, usury in capitalist conditions of production, more specifically, the formation of the credit system, takes place as a reaction against usury. This process frames the subordination and adaptation of money trading activities to the conditions and needs of capitalist production. What distinguishes interest-bearing capital, insofar as it is an essential element of the capitalist mode of production, from usurer's capital, interest-bearing capital versus usurer's capital, is by no means the nature or character of this capital itself, Marx writes. It is merely the altered conditions under which it operates, and consequently also the totally transformed character of the borrower who confronts the moneylender. And so in that one sense, you have, kind of an intersection, where you can look at the credit issues, but also the debt issues, in terms of Graeber, for example. So there's a whole dynamic in there that needs to be sort of worked out. Here, for Marx, is the historical meaning of the economist's polemics against usury at the dawn of capitalist production, as he insists, particularly in the annexes of the theories of surplus value. This is because, TSV, is an intermediate phase that he's trying to figure out what are all the historical conditions under which this is happening, and makes it a very, a vital part, on the one hand, of Marx's overall project, but also gets shunted to the side to become, the issue of the autonomous 3-volume theories of surplus value. Anyway, but this conversion of usury into the system of credit, or put another way, the subordination of financial activities to the dynamics of industrial capital, under certain historical circumstances, demands the intervention of state power. Marx illustrates this process, theoretical and practical, intellectual and political, with the example of 17th century England, particularly in authors like Thomas Culpeper, 1641, Josiah's Child, 1670, or William Patterson, one of the founders of the Bank of England, in 1694. Quote, now, this is, where it becomes more interesting. Let me break for a second. This is where it becomes more interesting, because it is kind of Marx confronting the kind of historical materialism of his day, or of his knowledge production, or whatever, So anyway, quote, the polemic waged by the bourgeois economists of the 17th century, Child, Culpeper, and others, against interest as an independent form of surplus value, merely reflects the struggle of the rising industrial bourgeoisie against the old-fashioned usurers who monopolized, yes, they did, the pecuniary resources at that time. Now, users monopolizing also needs to be situated within a kind of historical context, monarchies and other kinds of tribalism, all kinds of stuff. Interest-bearing capital in this case is still an antediluvian form of capital which has yet to be subordinated to industrial capital and to acquire the dependent position which it must assume both theoretically and practically on the basis of capitalist production. Dependent position, this is an interesting argument in that case, but that's a whole nother thing. The bourgeoisie did not hesitate to accept state aid, and this as in other cases where it was a question of making the traditional production relations, which it found adequate to its own. You could see, kind of the wheels turning for Marx in trying to confront, the transition, the mediation from feudalism to capitalism, and of course, addressing the larger question addressed by others on uneven development. But anyway, more fundamentally, the role of the state in the formation of finance capital fully emerged with the development of the means of financing the expenses of the modern state, that is, through public debt. Indeed, the necessity of financing the modern state played a decisive role in the formation of the modern system of credit. The creation of the Bank of England at the end of the 17th century illustrates this phenomenon. Let me break here for a second and point out, yes, there's this hegemonic thing that, that come from World War II that are, yes, dominant and problematic. And you can see that centuries are at work here. And of course, we see the torch shifted from Britain to America relative to their respective industrial revolutions. Quote, at their birth, the great banks, decorated with national titles, were only associations of private speculators, like the Fed, who placed themselves by the side of governments and, thanks to the privileges they received, were in a position to advance money to the state. Hence, the accumulation of the national debt has no more infallible measure than the successive rise in the stock of these banks, whose full development dates from the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. The Bank of England began with lending its money to the government at 8%. At the same time, it was empowered by Parliament to coin money out of the same capital by lending it again to the public in the form of banknotes. It was allowed to use these notes for discounting bills, making advances on commodities, and for buying precious metals. Right? This is that whole business about, fiat stuff. It was not long ere this credit money made by the bank itself became the coin in which the Bank of England made its loans to the state and paid, on account of the state, the interest on the public debt. It was not enough that the bank gave with one hand, took back more with the other. It remained, even whilst receiving, the eternal creditor of the nation down to the last shilling advanced. Gradually, it became inevitably the receptacle of the metallic hoard of the country and the center of gravity of all commercial credit. And you can see where Marx is headed on this. And it is an abstract set of notions, but, that's close quote. And I assume this is second edition of Capital. As a means of financing the modern state, bonds in turn became the main object of speculation on the stock market. State bonds continue to play this role as much as manufacturers and factories remain the dominant forms of enterprise. That is, business that basically use owned funds or bank credit. Marx distinguishes the stage of development of commercial credit from its intervention in production as a lever for investment and as a weapon of competition. However, it was only with the domination of the joint stock company, a process that occurred only in the second half of the 19th century, that's really important, that the functions of the stock exchange were transformed. Indeed, the dominance of joint stock companies and its correlate, the separation of capital ownership from capital function, as Marx describes the division between ownership and control, long before Barrel and Means in 1932, constitute, without, getting into that mishigash, I suppose, constitutes the real foundation for the full development of the top floor of the credit system, that is, the modern stock exchange. Now, we know that much more complicated than that and needs to be explicated in a variety of ways. But I've run out of time, and I urge you to look at the details of the many parts of this article and to get a sense of, that Marx wasn't all that far off, and also that we need to look a little bit more at Hilferding because, while he's not doing the work that Marx is looking at, dealing with, Hilferding in some ways is a product of his time. The interest in, from a historical point of view, the institutionalization of economies, which hinges on other kinds of works, Weber, Veblen, etc. So anyway, this paper makes 4 contributions. First, it abstracts a general definition of finance capital from Marx's elaboration of the monetary and credit system in Section 5 of Capital, Volume 3. For Marx, finance capital is the autonomization and monopolization of the operation of the money capital cycle by a special category of agents. Second, it highlights the main mechanisms behind the transformation of pre-capitalist usury into a credit system, even where the capitalist economy retains the old forms of usury. This is my common comment on, the 16th century Italian bank, but anyway, or whatever. Third, it shows that Hilferding's formal definition of finance capital as a fusion of bank and industrial capital corresponds to a theory of the financialization of capitalism, the thing that people like, Michael Hudson talk about. Some of the mechanisms of this process are based directly on Marx's analyses of the growing involvement of the system of credit in the process of accumulation, a process that is brought about through bank credit and the generalization of joint stock companies as the typical form of business or enterprise. Hilferding's theory of financialization implies changes in the composition and criteria of corporate governance. You see, we're already back to where we kind of currently are. Problems of corporate governance. A tendency for the income of managers to be increasingly related to the price of securities on the stock market, and the proliferation of methods and techniques peculiar to this financial circulation. It is on this basis that Hilferding deduces new forms of centralization of ownership and the strengthening of banks as institutions in charge of the operations of money capital for trade and industry as a whole. Finally, the respective analyses of finance proposed by Marx and Hilferding have implications for the study of the sociological composition of the bourgeoisie. Yeah, well, it objectively establishes the existence of a faction relatively opposed to the industrial and commercial capitalists in the first. Finance becomes the point of an antagonistic unification of the interests of the whole of the bourgeoisie in the second. So, that may be an unsatisfying point, well, it just, resolves itself down to, you need to analyze the structure of the bourgeoisie, but you do need to analyze the bourgeoisie. Um, and trashing it as whatever, as the PMC or blah 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 gets us um, not too far, but not as far as we'd like. Anyway, I got to the end, thank goodness. Um, and uh, I, I hope that people will appreciate that there is a body of academics um, who have looked at this kind of stuff, partially because, the European and Latin American economies, are more tolerant of trying to, get at the problem and sort of suspend their ideological, sort of anti-communist craziness to kind of get to a point where you say, okay, it's an agency structure problem. Don't have to talk about Marx. It still has, all of the issues are still there. You can't just sort of, dissolve it away in some bizarre ideology. So anyway, that's I've come to the end. I will, as they say, um, stop the live stream and stop the share. Pointing out, of course, that this is the 4th of February, uh, Wednesday office hours. And I've been looking at issues in financial Marxism, however you want to call that. Um, it is a subcategory for many people, but really important, I think, to understand how that operates, particularly with the larger interest in what constitutes wealth, credit debt, all those kinds of stuff. So I wish you a wonderful week, and